This episode of Warp 5 is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join in on the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode or any other, please join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, that's B-A-B-E-L, into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Manny Cotto, executive producer of Star Trek Enterprise. You're listening to Warp 5 on Trek FM.
How we doing, Trip? Ready when you are. Prepare for warp.
Course laid in, sir. Request permission to get underway. Let's go.
Welcome, Boomers, to another episode of Warp 5. I am your boy band host, Brandon-Shea Mutala. Joining me today is one of the Backstreet Boys himself, Patrick Devlin. How you doing, buddy?
Not as good as I was 10 minutes ago.
Why?
Oh, the Backstreet Boy himself. I can't dance to save my... You just got me fired from every job I have. So, thank you. No, I'm doing great. How are you?
I am doing just fine, and we have got a wonderful interview today, but you know what? It wouldn't be complete if we didn't have fellow co-host, Backstreet Girl, Brandi Jackola.
Backstreet Girl, Spice Girl. If we're...
Female, yeah, or
no.
female in sync at least.
I don't know these bands. I just listen to Justin Bieber. That's it.
Well, that's unfortunate. Anyway.
Well, he's a countryman, so...
I tweeted that once. I'm like...
And I'm very glad he's your countryman.
You know, I tweeted that once. I'm like, just as random, just to be funny. I'm like, you sing one Justin Bieber song at work, and all of a sudden, everybody's accusing you of having Bieber fever, and everybody's like, I hate him. It's like... And I'm like, I'm just kidding. I'm just making a joke. Anyways... But no, we're not here to talk about boy bands, although this reference will become clear later on in the episode because we've got ourselves a wonderful guest today. We're having an interview with Dave Rossi, and he was the associate producer on Enterprise for its run. He worked on Voyager for its whole run, and he worked on a couple years of Star Trek The Next Generation. And he even helped to produce the remastered original series DVDs and Blu-rays that came out. And we have already conducted the interview, but we talk all about this, plus Superman, plus the alternative factor. It's great. It's a great episode.
And we're in the room where you eat stuff.
Oh, and we're in the room where I'm so bad at this, Patrick. I'm so sorry. We're in the room where we eat stuff. Yes, and we have Backstreet Boys and other boy bands in the corner.
Yes.
And that'll become clear as we talk. I'm so bad.
And then, yes, and this very confusing intro will all become clear.
You know, I can do funny where can people find yous, but I'm not good at the rest of the stuff, I guess. I'm sorry. So... Patrick, where can people find you when you're not correcting me about my bad intro?
Did we do this already? They can still find me on Twitter.
Excellent.
Probably trying to correct you.
Probably trying to correct me. Well, I think it's time that we should just probably move right into the interview. Should we beam
Let's
him
beam
in?
him in.
Yeah, let's beam him in.
Let's do it. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dave. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about your work on Star Trek Enterprise, and I'm sure we're going to touch base, and we'll talk a little bit of Superman as well.
I look forward to talking.
Excellent, right on. Patrick, do you want to take it away with the first question?
Sure. What was your history with Star Trek prior to working on the show?
Prior to working on the show, I had really no history aside from being an obsessively rabid fan. I discovered the show when it was just first going into syndications, probably around 1972, and I was 7 or 8 years old at the time, and I was a diehard, Lost in Space fan at the time, and when I found Star Trek, it changed everything. Everything. I became just obsessed with it. And again, this is certainly way before the internet or the ability to connect with other fans, and so it was really a scramble to try and figure out how to find more information. And so you could join up to some fanzines, or you could pick up Starlog, and that was the kind of the extent for a kid from Buffalo, New York, to get involved. And then the licensing started as the show started getting popular, or I should say unlicensed things started, but there was a material boom for the show. And so that's when models started coming out, and toys, and most importantly for me, books. The Franz Josef technical manual was just a Bible for me for the show. I read it. I couldn't tell you how many times. And I would teach Star Trek at my house to the kids in the neighborhood. And I mean, I was just ravenous about it. And then through a very bizarre, quirky set of circumstances, I had no designs on going to Hollywood. I had no background in filmmaking or anything like that. It was pure luck and happenstance, and a little dose of passion, I would say, that got me there.
Mm-hmm. So you say that you loved Star Trek and that changed everything for you, but you watched Lost in Space. Are you telling me that the carrots in Lost in Space didn't change everything for you?
I was a huge fan of the robot, and that was really my hook for Lost in Space. I mean, certainly even as a 5, 6, 7-year-old kid watching it, the talking carrot and the goofy guy who ran the interstellar department store, who did that popping sound with his cheek. I mean, all those, it was really high camp and silly. It was, it was the Batman TV show, but seeing, the very, very first episode of Star Trek I saw was This Side of Paradise. And I tuned in just as the landing party was beaming down to the planet. And, first that was something in itself. That level of visual effect was something I'd never seen before. So I was immediately engaged. But watching that episode, the character of Captain Kirk just, leapt off the screen, and the whole thing with his ship slowly mutinying and leaving for the planet, and him being left alone, and just his force of will to overcome these wacky plants. I mean, it just really, I don't know how to say it captivated me any stronger than that. It just really, really took control of my life for a long time.
Now, I do want to ask about the remastering of the TOS episodes, but before we go on, I do want to touch on one little tangent here before we go on. Have you seen the trailer for the new Lost in Space?
I just saw it over the weekend. Yes, I did.
It looks pretty outstanding. I'm pretty excited to check this out. It's coming out right away here.
It looks pretty good.
Is it this week?
Yeah, I think the 13th.
Yeah, that's Friday.
Yeah.
That's this week. Ooh, good grief.
Yeah, as of recording, it's coming out the Friday of the recording here. This will be dropping the week after it starts airing. But yeah, I'm excited. Cool to check it out. So
yeah, I'm excited to see it too. And they're taking an interesting path with the robot, that he's not part of the crew. It's something they find.
Right.
Yeah, that'll be interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I know that we're on the Enterprise podcast here, but I do have to ask you about working on the remastering of the TOS episodes. How did you get involved with that? And, what exactly were you doing to help the Akutas to prepare this event? And, who all were you working with to create these episodes?
Well, CBS and Paramount, I believe at the time I don't remember if they had just split. I think maybe they had just split, and CBS syndication was looking to reintroduce Star Trek to syndicated stations around the country, around the world. And I had a meeting with a gentleman I'd worked with before in their TV syndication department. His name was David LaFontaine, and he was their senior vice president of syndicated television. And so he took me to lunch and he said, listen, we have this idea that we want to reintroduce Star Trek, but nobody wants to buy it. There are no advertisers who will jump on board because the show is 40 years old. And it's, been running in syndication since the early 70s. So their question to us is, why would we pay money for this old rag? And he said, so we're trying to figure out ways we can enhance that experience so advertisers will jump on board. And he threw out, there were a couple different things that he threw out. And honestly, I don't remember all of them, but the one he seemed most excited about was visual effects. So he said to me, we're thinking about hiring some company somewhere to redo the visual effects of the original series. And I remember saying, because George Lucas had just gone through the spank machine after doing what he did with his movies, and people saying that he destroyed their childhood and that whole thing. And so I said to him, this is a horrible idea. You're going to get somebody who's going to want to just change everything for the sake of change. And I said, this is a horrible idea. You're just going to bite off a lot more than you can chew with this, with fandom. They're going to turn on you. And I said, as I would. I mean, I wouldn't want to see the Enterprise redesigned, and I all of that stuff. So I said, I think this is a huge mistake. I would go back to the drawing board. And so he said, why don't you think about it and take a couple of weeks, see if you can come up with something else, and then let's meet again for lunch and talk it through. And so we did. So a couple of weeks later, I came back and I said, well, I don't know what else you could do besides what you're saying, but I still think what you're saying is a colossal mistake. And he said, well, what if I could find someone who would do it, but respect the material? What if I could find someone who would not change the design of the Enterprise, but just update it and do those kinds of things? And I said, well, if you could find somebody like that, go ahead, but good luck. And he said, well, how would you like to do it? And I, in about a half second, said, okay. This was, everything kind of went out the window. And I was like, wait a minute, you're saying I would have the ability to kind of set the template for what this would be. There's no visual effects people telling me that the Enterprise should be doing barrel rolls and we're going to change phasers and he said, no, this would be your thing. And you can produce it the way you see fit. And we'll give you a budget and well, the only snag to it was at the time Enterprise had just ended. And I was about to take a new job with Paramount. And they, in taking this new job, they had threatened that I would be doing a lot of traveling. And so I said to David, well, I would love to take this job. I said, but I'll have to bring somebody else in to help because I'm starting this job soon and there's a threat that I'll be traveling a lot. So I wouldn't want to leave you in the lurch. And he said, you can bring in whoever you want, but budget stays the same. You're going to get paid the same. And I said, okay, that's fine. And so I went to Mike and Denise and because while I was out of work between Enterprise and Paramount, they were kind enough to employ me for a few months while they were doing the CBS auction. So I was helping them catalog things and identify things from the years and years and years of Star Trek props and wardrobe and all of this stuff that had accumulated in these various warehouses around Southern California. And so I came to Mike and Denise. I said, hey, what do you guys think if they redid the visual effects for the original series and put it back in syndication? And Mike and Denise said, that's a horrible idea. And I said, but what if we were in charge of it? and Mike said, what? And I said, what if we were in charge of it? And so of course they came around as well. I mean, it was a chance for us to honor, something that was very sacred to us. And look, Mike Okuda is a student of not only filmmaking, but certainly of Star Trek and how it was done. I don't have that level of expertise. I was never aiming my career at trying to get into the film business. So I'm not a filmmaker per se. And I don't study, the techniques and the production and the things the way that Mike certainly did. I'm more interested in, I love the fictional worlds that these franchises create, and that's really my passion for it. So getting Mike involved and getting Denise involved was kind of a no-brainer. And so with very, very little budget and very little time before they wanted to air the first episode, we approached Doug Drexler. And Doug Drexler was not only a visual effects person associated with Star Trek for many years, but he also then went on and ran the visual effects department for Battlestar Galactica, the Ron Moore reboot. And so we negotiated a deal with him, and he sent us a test, and we were blown away. I mean, we just were, over the moon. But then somebody at CBS, somewhere in there, I don't know if it was their legal department or somewhere, somebody found out that the project was happening. And they have this little visual effects house, well, not so little anymore, but at the time, called CBS Digital. And they said, you have to bid it with these guys. You have to give these guys a chance to do it. And, we'd never heard of them. So we were aghast. We were just like, no, you don't understand. We've got the guy. And they were very insistent. So as an underhanded, sneaky ploy, what we did was we went in and bid it to CBS Digital, but we made the schedule and the budget sound so unpalatable that no visual effects house in their right mind would take this job. So we went in, and it was a guy named Craig Weiss who ran the department for CBS Digital, and then their visual effects supervisor, Neil Ray, who in the long run turned out to be our guardian angel. So it really couldn't have been better. But it was those two guys in a room, and then their boss at CBS, and he was this guy who he stood in the doorway and never said a word. He just stood there kind of silently while we were all talking this out. And they said, so what's the deal? And we said, well, you have 2 weeks to deliver the first 2 episodes. And you are going to have to build the Enterprise from scratch because there's no existing model that we have. I mean, we tried to make this sound as crazy as possible. And we were sure walking in there, they're never going to take this. And so we spit this out, and Craig turns to this guy in the doorway, and the guy in the doorway just silently nods his head yes, and Craig goes, we'll do it. We were like,
Oh, man.
what? We were like, what do you mean? You'll do it? Let's do it. Well, the rubber hit the road when, you see, the contract was it was a bit ambiguous. What it said was that they would, we were going to replace all of the exterior shots. We were going to redo the planet exteriors as far as from space, all space shots basically, and episode specific shots. And then if there were time, we would work on some of the matte paintings as well, if we could do that. Well, the way CBS Digital interpreted that was there were something like 17 shots of the Enterprise across the entire series of the show, aside from things that they needed to do that were very episode specific. So that's how they interpreted what they were going to do. They thought, okay, we'll take this shot because we're just going to be reproducing 17 shots of the Enterprise, and then, we'll make a doomsday device. And, I mean, it was, they looked at it that way. Well, what Mike and Denise and I had planned was something, we envisioned 300 new shots of the Enterprise. I'm taking from every kind of angle you can imagine. I mean, the whole point of this was to elevate the show for syndication. That's what we assumed it meant. So they took the job, and then the way it would work is every week, I forget how we did it. We divvied up the show. Mike, like for instance, Mike did even shows and I did odd shows or something like that. And we would put together these Excel sheets where we would each watch a show and put the time code down for every place there was a visual effect that needed changing. And then we would get together, and as we went through that list and watched the episode, we would start envisioning what those shots were. Well, this would be a shot of the Enterprise looking this way. This would be this way. And part of the problem of the schedule was that we had no way to change the length of any shots. So, for instance, if there was a 1.4 second shot, of the Enterprise, that's what we had to fill it with. So there was only, I think, 2 times maybe where we changed the length of a shot, but that's what we had to work with. So it was very constraining, and fortunately, when we would go to Neil Ray and say, he'd say, this isn't a shot on the list, and we'd say, I know, but look at this shot. I mean, wouldn't you want to see the Enterprise this way? I mean, and then that started, and he would do it because he was excited. And then that started leaking into, what would be really cool is if the Gorn blinked. Could we just make his eyes blink a couple times? And he'd go, yeah, I don't know. All right, we'll see what we can do. Hey, in this episode, Scotty's firing a phaser at this bulkhead, but no beam is coming out of the gun. Can we add a beam to, and so it was this slow kind of, we got some great shots out of him. Norman the android lifting his stomach to show his interior. I mean, they got rid of the old radio transistors and put some new kind of, visual effect mechanization in there that looked really cool. So it, we slowly started doing, but eventually it became an issue of money and time. And so we all ended up getting hauled into a very contentious meeting at CBS, and the head of CBS TV City was in there, and it was me and David LaFontaine on one side of the table and CBS Digital on the other. And it was the CBS Digital guys, and not wrongfully so. They just had a different interpretation of what the contract was. They said, listen, they're going to bankrupt us if they keep, they come to us with 150 different shots for every episode. We can't possibly continue to do this. And so this head of the TV City turned to me and said, well, what do you have to say for yourself? I mean, the contract says this. And I said, listen, the contract is ambiguous as to what we want. The point of this is to get advertisers to buy this show. And they're not going to buy the show because you replaced 17 shots. That's still the same show. So what we've done is made it dynamic enough that you can tout every episode as a different episode, and the fans are going to love it. I mean, it's, we're slavishly faithful to what the original intent was, and maybe too much so when it comes down to it. I mean, we probably could have, done some things that, like, I know Neil at CBS Digital, as we got closer to the end of the series, he was thinking, what if we took some tiny elements of the Enterprise from Star Trek: The Motion Picture and worked them into this Enterprise? We were like, no, you can't do that. But there were suggestions that came out that maybe we should have entertained had we had the time and whatever. But anyway, so it all worked out. The guy finally said, okay, you can add 2 new shots per episode at this point because you've got enough to reuse, and then and just finish the job and get out of my sight. And we were like, okay, well, that's a deal. And so that's how it did. And we had like, just quickly, Mike Mike does a lot of work with NASA, design work and things. And so, a lot of the stuff that he really loved was working with a guy named Max Gable, who was their matte painting artist. And so he and Mike would work on redoing the matte paintings and working on the exteriors of the planets, and some of the things like that. Like I remember working on the Botany Bay, Mike had them really get close on like how the hatches worked, things you wouldn't really ever see, but he, relished the idea of using today's technology to kind of expand that stuff. And so that was kind of his forte. And my forte was all the battles. So I remember Captain Kirk would lay out a plan in an episode, and all you'd see is the Enterprise moving left to right, and the music going dun, 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 it was nothing like what was explained on the TV. So I got to kind of get my hands dirty with a lot of that stuff. So that was a lot of fun.
Excellent, right on. Yeah, it's an outstanding set, and I couldn't resist not asking you about it because it's pretty cool what they did, and you guys definitely kept it faithful to what it was, and you didn't have like six Gorn walking in front of the camera, So I'm okay. I think it's good.
Well,
so,
thank
good
you,
job.
thank you very much. I hope I didn't talk too long about it.
No, not at all, not at all.
In fact, we're actually coming up on the anniversary of completing it in a week. I think a week or two. It'll be
about 10 years now.
I think it'll be 10 years.
Yeah.
Well, as a person who basically has been watching Star Trek longer than she knew what Star Trek was, I mean, my parents watched it, so we all watched it. I love what was done with the remaster. It's absolutely glorious, and I love.
Oh, thank you.
Everything. I watched it on Netflix just to see what was what really, and I just thought. It almost brought tears. No, it did bring tears to my eyes. Let's be honest. I'm a crier. I'm a crier.
You and my wife.
Anyway, yeah, it's I'm not ashamed of that. So, but I just really appreciate the work that you did.
Well, thank you. It was really a passion project. It really was. There was no money and no time, and it was that classic kind of thing. But we loved every minute of it.
Of course, those are the best kind of projects. So right. Now you are listed as a production associate for seasons 5 through 7 of The Next Generation. How is that different from what you did on Enterprise?
Well, on the show, the producer's assistants couldn't get screen credits as assistants. I don't know what the rule was, but the production was kind enough to come up with the title production associate, and that kind of grouped in all of us who otherwise wouldn't have been able to get credits. So while I started on the 5th season of Next Gen as a PA, and then in the 6th and 7th seasons, I was Mary Howard's assistant. And so I eventually got a credit for that. I think the last season of Next Gen might have even been just the last episode. But then with Voyager, we started getting credits as production associates. So it was they didn't have to do that. It was just something they did to kind of throw us a bone for all the work we did. So it was very nice.
Well, good, because you should get credit for all the work you did.
At what point of the production process were you hired on Enterprise?
I moved to Enterprise right at the conclusion of Voyager. I was so when Next Generation entered its 7th season, Deep Space Nine was starting its 1st season, and half of the crew was split, and half of the people went to DS9 and half of us stayed on finishing up Next Generation, and then Voyager started a season after that, and we all moved right to that. So my track was Next Gen, Voyager, Enterprise, and although I worked on Deep Space Nine, I wasn't a member of the staff as a lot of people were until I became Rick Berman's assistant, and then of course, you get your hands in everything.
What was the general mood like during the first season of Enterprise, like during the production of it? We've heard tell that Berman and Braga didn't really want to start production on a new show so soon after Voyager was all finished up. And, did that affect the atmosphere of the production, or did they go ahead all guns a-blazing?
Well, this is something that actually started in Voyager. When Deep Space Nine launched and the studio came and said, now we want you to do another one, that was the first time Rick asked them to kind of pump the brakes a little bit and let Deep Space Nine find its footing first. And the studio was very, the show was so hot at the time. Next Gen was coming off, these, Emmy recognition for a syndicated show and these huge ratings. And then Deep Space Nine started. And so they just wanted to keep going. So it becomes this thing where the studio is going to do it anyway. So it becomes a question of, do you want to be a part of it or not? And the same thing happened with Enterprise. After Voyager, Rick was like, guys, we've got to take a break. Let the field become fallow for a little bit and let people build up their desire to want to watch a Star Trek series again. And then let's jump in and do it. But the studio, they were just launching UPN, I guess. And so they wanted some kind of signature show to be part of that package. And that's what Enterprise was going to become. And so they pushed forward. And at some point, Rick had to he just went along with it because he had the experience to do it. And so we had this well-oiled machine. It seemed crazy for us to all, quit out of spite or something. So he took the job and developed Enterprise with Brandon. And that was an interesting, the idea of going back and doing something kind of re-energized everybody. I think everybody was really excited. And it was a fun development process. And for to be in Rick's office at that time and be a fan of the original series the way I was invited into a lot of development meetings with he and Brandon to talk about, where kind of what things they talked about on Star Trek, the original series, and where the government was and where, just where these things were, so they could work backwards to try and figure out how to piece together Enterprise. I think there was always concern. I mean, because, people were, the ratings were continued to dip on every successive show. Not in any horrific way. The shows would have immediately been canceled, but they continued to kind of slide. And so there was, we all kind of felt like, boy, it would have been nice for the studio to listen to Rick and take a break, but that just wasn't how it played out. So, you put your best foot forward and you go for it.
True. I'm not sure that it was a lack of interest because where I live, they shuffled around the time of that show all the time. The local affiliate did. So they would be preempted because of a sport event. They might show it at 3 o'clock on a Saturday morning and not tell anybody. And this was back before I had a DVR. I didn't even know what a DVR was then. And so that was my experience, is that I missed almost all of season 3 because I could never find it on. And yeah, you can set a VCR to record it, but it's only going to record on that channel at that time. And most of the time it was a sporting event. So it was very
That's right. It was,
frustrating
you're right.
for me.
It was frustrating because I remember that there were a lot of complaints about the fact that wrestling was preempting Enterprise.
Yeah, it was very hard.
Well, they didn't.
Anyway.
I'll tell you another story real quickly. The network didn't understand the show really, or really embrace it in that way. They came to us at one point and said, "Hey, that place where they eat on the ship?" And we were like, "Yeah, the mess hall." And they said, "What if every week there was a different boy band playing music in there for the crew?"
Oh, Lord. Oh, no.
And, we had to say, you understand the premise of the show, right? We're leaving Earth to explore the galaxy. We're not stopping and picking up boy bands. And their whole thing was, well, you have to understand, using musical bands and creating that synergy is really big now. And it's like, well, that's great, but that... we're not going to stop off at Deneb IV to pick up the Backstreet Boys. I mean, it's just.
I can promise you that would have been the end of my love of Enterprise.
Yeah.
This is the best laugh I've had in days.
This fan greatly thanks you. I have a podcast to do because that never happened.
Well, I don't know. I could just picture it now. I mean, we could have had Justin Bieber on if it was made now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but so there's boy bands and Trillium D and the Zindi all in,
good grief.
in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah. And they play in that place where they ate.
Yeah, just that little area.
This is hilarious to me. Oh.
And it was specific to boy bands, which is even worse.
Yeah.
It wasn't like the canteen scene in Star Wars. Oh, it was gonna be boy bands every week.
Yeah.
Well, they had the girls covered with the isolation, or not the isolation ward, with the petroleum jelly.
You're right, the guru.
They came up from the
Right.
guru.
The decontamination chamber? Is that what you're
Yes.
talking
Thank you.
Yes, that
Yeah, the
was.
blue guru.
I knew what he meant when he said jelly room because it's always some salve. You gotta put on
I'm sorry.
there.
I'm the producer of the podcast, and I don't know what the podcast is about.
Oh my gosh.
That room where they did that thing with the jelly.
Yes.
Decon,
That's right.
yeah, I know.
That's right. The jelly room. And for us, it was that was the first time working on Enterprise was the first time. Well, a couple things had kind of played out that changed things a little bit. First of all, the ruling regime at the studio changed in the TV division, and so that changed a lot of things when Enterprise came out as well. Because while Next Generation was going and up through Voyager, we were doing so well that it was hands off. The studio and everybody didn't interfere with anything. I mean, if there was some egregious problem they had, or there was some director they wanted to use or guest star they wanted to use, certainly they would contact us. But typically we were free to run the show the way we wanted because it was so successful. But with Enterprise, that changed. So then there were a lot of notes from the studio, from the network, and that was a little tough to swallow. And maybe it was just that we were, we were just used to running the show the way we felt best. But this was a whole other level of involvement from these other entities, and that was tough as well.
That has to be frustrating. Okay, I may know the answer to this question based on things you've said already, but of all the Star Trek you have worked on, and there seems to be quite a bit, what was your favorite project and why?
Well, my knee-jerk reaction was to just say remastered.
That's what I thought you would say. Because really,
but I have to say, working on Next Generation as well was, it was pretty magical. I had no intent of getting into this business, let alone working on a Star Trek show, and to, one day walk through a couple of doors and there's the bridge or there's the engine room. I mean, and then to get to know these people, who I'd only been watching on television. I mean, it's, I made a lot of longstanding friendships, and not just actors, but with so many people on the crew and some actors too. I mean, I see a handful of the Next Gen actors every year at a great 4th of July party that Rick Berman throws, and so it's always great to catch up with those guys. But that, being my very first TV show that I ever worked on, and that was pretty magical too. It's somewhere in between those two, because working on Remastered was like, I mean, it would be like somebody walking me into a room and introducing me to Superman. I mean, it's that thing where and they say, here, you can do what you want with this. And so we got to what we felt, got to fix some of the problems we felt existed. We got to enhance some of the things that were already great, but could use a veneer. And I mean, it was wonderful.
I love it. Love it.
So, what were the difficulties and benefits of working on a prequel to all the other Star Trek series? And were there any continuity conflicts?
Oh boy. Yes, it's tough to do a show like that because you want the freedom to tell stories, but you're always threatened to step on the toes of what came before. It's funny. I was just having a conversation today on Twitter about Discovery, and they just announced that they've announced who's going to play Captain Pike. Right. And so that immediately got into a question of, well, wait a minute, if they're meeting Captain Pike, it's 10 years before Enterprise, but then they jumped ahead a year in the show, so like 8 to 9 years. But then didn't Spock say in an episode that the cage takes place 13 years ago from the time of the... I mean, it was like this conversation, this continuity conversation, and it can be such a tangled web, and especially for shows that have this kind of following, where people know this stuff inside and out, and it's important to them. There are people who will, take the side of, well, being canon or continuity is ridiculous as you move down the road. You just have to kind of let it slide and let it. And there are others who feel very strongly that's the thread that kind of makes it a complete universe for them. So there's no right or wrong answer. It just depends on what seat you're sitting in, So yes, were there continuity problems? Yes, and I don't remember. I couldn't give you super specific continuity issues that happened, but I can tell you that when we did, I know a lot of people enjoy the fourth season. That's their favorite season because it touches on a lot of things that fans kind of already knew through exposure to other episodes. Where did the Klingon heads go and what, things like that. But I remember there was an episode that came out that when the script came out, it talked about how we meet the Organians. And it was, the script was much different than what finally came out. But I remember walking into Rick's office with a head of steam, and saying, this is an episode of Star Trek, the original series. These characters appear and it's supposedly the first time we meet them, and we're not supposed to meet them for another, and I start telling him the story, and he's like, whoa, Dave, calm it down there, Tiger. And so he I remember he spoke to Manny about it, and I'm sure it was going to change anyway, but there are those kinds of things where you would, I would see certain things and bring them to his attention. That's the one that I remember being the most kind of like, hey, wait a minute now. But yeah, it happened from time to time. And being followers of the show, were there any glaring continuity issues that jump out to you?
I'm sure there's a few in there. I mean, we kind of retcon things in our head and whatnot. And I actually want to mention the fact that you mentioned this episode. The episode's called Observer Effect, the one that you're talking about. And I have the same reaction that you have to that episode, except for that's my favorite episode of the fourth season. And whenever I go into it, the episode, like I start watching the episode and I'm like, why did they do this episode? Like, did we need this in the fourth season? And then I watch it and I'm like, this episode is so damn good. And I just go with it and I just love it by the end of the episode. That's my favorite episode of the fourth season. I love it hands down because it's so creepy and cool,
And it changed quite a bit. It changed quite a bit from the original, but yeah, it's one of those things where and they're going through it now on Discovery, right? Where and I've even I've come down on both sides of it online talking to people, and you know, you look at, there are the things you love and there are the things that you don't care about, and if you don't care about them, it's okay to say, yeah, whatever, let them do what they want. But to somebody else, that's like, you know, punching them in the face. You know, it's an assault. So so it's interesting that they chose that timeline to do, and they're sandwiched in between things now.
Yes.
Which is even tougher. But
what do you think of Star Trek Discovery?
I think the first season was a little muddled from a storytelling point of view. I think they had a direction, and then I know that the executive producer left the show, but after having, I don't know what, 2 or 3 scripts already done, and that's hard, you know, it's hard to pick up because now because of the nature of the show, the way it's being told as a serialized show, you've now got to pick up that thread and kind of run with it and do what you can with it. So you know, there was a lot to like. It's a beautiful show. The acting is unbelievable. I don't know that I would have made the choices they made. I didn't think going into the mirror universe was the greatest choice for a first season. You know, I barely know the Discovery crew, let alone now throwing me into the mirror universe to do it. And I felt that, you know, some of the choices they made with Starfleet, you know, when you're at war with the Klingons and twice you have to go to different aliens and say, hey, how'd you deal with the Klingons? It felt like Starfleet was a bit inept. Like they couldn't kind of take charge. They're in the middle of this war. And then when the solution is, you know, the evil mirror emperor comes back and says, well, I think we should just kill them all. And everyone goes, yeah, okay, let's try that. that seemed a little...
Yeah, sounds good to me. We're not Starfleet or nothing.
Exactly. You know, so I think they were kind of rushing to the finish line, but I am excited for season 2. And I you know, they've got a kind of a clear slate now, and they can start it and end it as they see fit. And look, it's not like season 1s of other shows have all been fantastic. So, you know, I'll give them their due, because certainly the acting is great. The production value is great. I'm looking forward to see what they can do on season 2.
So what was your favorite episode of Enterprise?
Wow, that's a good question. I like the first season episodes the best, frankly. I love the episode where we're still learning about our technology. I love the episode where they're on a planet and they have to beam the guy up in the middle of a storm, and when he gets up, he's like got sticks and leaves sticking out of his body. Because of the
strange new world.
Yeah, because the transporter can't, you know, distinguish between those things. Part of the joy of that series for me, and I remember having conversations with Rick and Brandon about it, was, you know, the phaser becomes the weapon of the Federation that they use for the next 200-300 years. Let's see why that is. You know what I mean? When you introduce the phaser, let's make it cool. When you introduce deflector shields, let's see that. I had a real kind of fondness for them telling stories, or wanting them to tell stories about how these technologies came about. I thought that was fun, and also, I mean, certainly the foundation of the Federation and all of that stuff. But yeah, I think the first season was the most fun for me. I know
Fantastic.
That's kind of anathema to what most people say. I think most people go for the 4th season.
You know?
Well, there's some really great stuff in the first season, like the episode that they got Dean Stockwell on, like Detained.
Right.
Like that's one of the best of the series for sure.
Right.
You know, like, and it's still valid today. You know, it's almost more important today than it was then. And you know, the one with Clancy Brown, Desert Crossing, is really good.
Yep.
Just because Clancy Brown is so amazing, you know. But there's a lot of great stuff in season 1. And we were talking ahead of the show before we hit record, and you had mentioned that you've had some interaction with people, and they say that they think that Enterprise has aged like a fine wine, and it's, you know, it's become better with age.
That's true. I would say the majority, if not all of the people who bring up Enterprise to me, or if that comes into the conversation in some way, they'll say something along the lines of, yeah, I just caught a couple episodes of that and it was really good. It was a lot better than I remembered. And I don't know where that comes from, but I think it's an interesting observation.
Yeah, we think it's because of the franchise fatigue. Like, there's just so much Star Trek for so long, that, and then people are maybe getting tired of how much Star Trek there was, and so they weren't giving it a fair chance during its initial run.
Yeah, and so they're just starting to discover it.
Thing.
Exactly. Now they're just starting to discover it again, which is kind of cool, and which is the same for all Star Trek, which is great. I think any new show that comes on and kind of entices people to see what came before it is great. Great for the franchise.
Fabulous. So are there any other stories from your work on Enterprise that we haven't asked about that you want to tell us about?
No, I know that sounds really boring, but Enterprise was, as we got to the end of the third season, we started seeing the cracks, and we started seeing that UPN was maybe going to pull the plug. And then we got one more season out of it in the fourth season. And we had a great turnout at the studio at one point where a lot of fans showed up to say, renew it. And people with billboards. And I mean, it was like, the old letter writing days. It was really fun and really engaging and great to see fans out there who were passionate and decided to come out and show their love for the show. And so it was interesting in that way because we didn't have that on the other shows. I mean, certainly, look, when I was on Next Generation, you couldn't go anywhere without somebody either being a Star Trek fan or knowing a Star Trek fan who wanted to talk to you about the show. But that's different than the show kind of fighting for its survival and people kind of jumping on board. That was a really unique experience, unique to Enterprise.
Do you remember what episode you guys were working on when you found out that the show was going to be canceled in season 4?
Boy, I don't. You'd think you'd think that would stick with me, but
that's okay.
Yeah, and it really was like walking around in haze, man. I had been on the show for 14 years, and these departments had started wrapping all their stuff and you started saying goodbye to people. And it really didn't hit me that it was over until I went into what had previously been our wardrobe department, which was this, huge cavernous space filled with wardrobe, like 3 and 4 costumes high to the ceiling on these giant racks. And it was completely empty. And I walked in there and there was no one there and it was completely empty. And I just remember I started crying. I was like, that's where it hit me. Like, oh my God, this is over. And it was a really sad moment because I loved everyone I worked with, and certainly working on Star Trek was, for never being part of the plan was just a dream come true. So, but yeah, I remember that's where it really hit me, seeing this one kind of vibrant, crazy space full of people and things just emptied was really kind of gutting.
Well, yeah, you put 14 years into it, hey?
Yeah, to the day. I started on May 13th and ended on May 13th.
Oh, well.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's veer off into another territory here, because I want to know when your love for Superman began. I want to know your opinions on how they've taken the direction of the character with the DC Cinematic Universe, and I really want to know, have you watched Krypton, and if so, what are your thoughts?
All right. Let's see.
3-part question.
When was I introduced to the character? Well, I think, as a kid, I watched a lot of cartoons, and, Saturday morning was take an entire box of some sugar-sweetened cereal, pour it into a giant salad bowl, and eat it while watching 3 hours of cartoons, and then, go out and play with your friends. So
I still do that.
Yes. I wish I still did that.
I wish. Yeah, right. Exactly. So that was my introduction to Superman, because I would see the Super Friends was on the weekends, and then during the week it was the Filmation Adventures of Superman with Bud Collyer doing the voice, who also did the radio shows, and he had that really deep voice that will always kind of weirdly be Superman to me. So I had an introduction to the character, and I knew who all these characters were. But I was when I was I guess 8, 9 years old, I was very ill, and I missed most of 3rd grade, and I was home and my parents were trying to get me, tutoring and homeschooling because I couldn't go to school. And my father, who I was the youngest of 5 children, and I am the youngest of 5 children, and my dad, he was a World War II vet, and he, was a boxer in his youth and a baseball player. And, I was D&D and Star Trek. And so we didn't have a very close relationship. We didn't get each other until I was much older. And but one day he came home and brought with him, I don't know if you remember what the Treasury Edition comics were. They were these giant, oversized comic books. I'll send you a picture of one. You can see what I'm talking about. But
I'm old enough to know what you're talking about.
yeah, and so
I'm not.
yeah, they were called Treasury Editions, and it was basically the size of like the old Life magazine, these big Look magazine, these big giant magazines. And my dad brought me home a stack of these he had found somewhere, and I was sick in my room, and he came in and he brought them to me, and one was Superman. It was Superman, one was Shazam, and one was Tarzan. And that was kind of the first time my dad had taken a moment to kind of consider that I like these things and that they were important to me. And he found these somewhere, wherever he was on his travels, and picked them up and brought it to me. And that Superman comic I still have to today. And because it was a gift from my dad, but also just that was the first comic book I had read. And that really launched me into the character. And so from that time on, I was a huge Superman fan, but I never collected the comics. I only collected Marvel comics as a kid, and I didn't collect Superman comics again until back in the early 90s. We had the riots out here in California, and I was living with a roommate at the time, and they instigated a curfew. So when the streetlights come on, you had to be in your house or you got arrested. And so my roommate at the time, who we're still friends today, but at the time he said, if they make us stay in the house together, in the apartment together, we're going to kill each other. We should go buy a board game or something. And so as we were on our way to buy a couple of board games, he said to me, did you ever collect comics when you were a kid? And I said, yeah. And he said, you want to go to a comic store and buy a bunch of old comics? And I was like, yeah, that's a great idea. And so I walked into this comic store. They were just building up to the death of Superman. And so I picked up a couple of comics, and one was a Batman comic, and it was very, very dark and adult. And I went to the owner of the comic shop, and I said, well, when I was a kid, it was, Spider-Man was fighting Electro and, the Sandman. And this is like, yeah, but this is, Batman going against a drug ring. And, I was like, are kids reading these today? And so he pointed out that there's, some of of course, all these kids who had grown up reading Batman comics or whatever they were, now they're writing them. And so he said, so the storytelling has evolved, and there are still books for kids, and but now there are books for adults as well that skew a little more adult. And so I grabbed a bunch of them, and it was, again, building up to the death of Superman a couple issues before that happened. And so I jumped on board, and I've been collecting now ever since. And I am a I collect typically both Marvel and DC, but over the last year and a half or so, maybe close to 2 years, my Marvel consumption has gone down to almost nothing, and DC Comics can do no wrong. They recently did their rebirth. I don't know if you're aware of it, but they they launched and kind of not really relaunched them, but relaunched them with the directive to creators to really get into the characters' heads and make them who they used to be. Because even DC, when they were doing their New 52 and whatnot, there was points where the characters were all kind of interchangeable and they all had the same voice, and so they really went on a push to kind of recreate these characters and make them the way they used to be, and give them their own voices. And it's been a stellar success as far as I'm concerned. I look forward to every Wednesday now to go get my comics. I just think they're doing a great job. As for the DC cinematic universe, well, my favorite movie involving Superman of that whole run of movies from Man of Steel to Justice League is the third trailer to the Superman movie.
We
That's
are
my
of the
favorite
same
Man
mind.
of Steel movie.
I got time to watch that. I'm gonna go watch that.
Yeah, it's type in Man of Steel trailer number 3, and that's my favorite Man of Steel movie right now. There's a lot that I liked about the first Man of Steel movie. There were a couple things, and I understood they were taking chances, but there were a couple things that just didn't hit it for me. And you know, I want to be able to take, and back then he was even younger, he's 9 now, but I wanted to take my son to enjoy a Superman movie, and I didn't feel I could take him to that movie and have him enjoy it. And I think a lot of it might have scared him. As hokey as the Chris Reeves Superman first movie can be at times, you still walk out of that movie feeling joyful. You feel hopeful, you feel jazzed, you're smiling when he smiles at the camera. I mean, that's what a Superman movie should convey, in my opinion. And so I don't think that they're doing, he obviously, Zack Snyder went for this other thing, which is, what if superheroes really existed? What would it be like? What would it be like for them? What would it be like for us? And I don't know, to me, while that's an interesting comic book thing to explore, I don't want to take 10 years to get through a series of movies about it so that he can eventually become Superman the way I like him. That's kind of my take on it. I think they hit it out of the park with Wonder Woman. I love that movie. Justice League, it was great seeing those characters on the screen, and there are certainly some moments that I just love the hell out of, but it's a sloppy movie. I think they made mistakes with demanding first that its running time be locked before they even did anything. Certainly bringing in both directors is that you can obviously tell. But even things like, I know there are a lot of people who love Man of Steel, and I like a lot of it, but I think we're at an interesting point in our culture now where whether or not something is a good movie is one part of the equation. What another part is it a good Superman movie is another part of the equation. And I think people don't look at those two things. I think they put that all together. And if it's, for instance, if it's not the Superman they want, then it's a horrible movie. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. It might not be a good Superman movie, but it can be a good movie. You know what I mean? I think you can get the same thing of Star Trek or James Bond or anything. Whether or not it's a good movie is one thing. Whether or not it's a good Star Trek movie is another thing. But I think that line gets blurred a lot. So, and Batman versus Superman, I've read The Dark Knight. I get it. Batman's got to win. So there's nothing new in that movie for me.
Yeah, the only thing that was, yeah, just the casting was weird for me.
Yeah. Well, I think that what they did with Henry Cavill in Justice League is at least let the Superman I like peek out, and so I hope they continue with that.
I agree wholeheartedly. No, I was just going to say, what about Krypton? Have you watched Krypton? I want to know. I want to know.
I have. I've watched. I'm an episode behind. I haven't watched the third episode yet.
Okay.
But yeah, it's fun. It's a new take. It's refreshing. I'm not a big fan of Adam Strange, the way they portray him, but
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. I don't get that choice, but I like how they're setting up the different houses, and I like that there's kind of this, I don't know, kind of slum side of Krypton, and it's not the spotless, sparkling planet advanced population you always think of. I think those are fun choices, so I'm interested to see where it goes.
As am I, and so is my 80-year-old mother. She loves it. Yep, she's a nerd, and she birthed 3 nerds, and I'm one of them.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing where they go with it.
Fantastic.
So, what are you working on now that you can let the listeners in on?
Well, I work now for a division of Paramount that licenses out the Paramount name and its properties to firms that are trying to build theme parks overseas, that want to brand their parks with Western intellectual properties. And so there's nothing built yet, but we're working on a lot of stuff. And a lot of times I get to kind of dip my toes back in the Star Trek pool because that's a movie Paramount works on, and we have a great relationship with CBS, and CBS doesn't currently have a themed entertainment division, so we do a lot of cross work with them, which is a lot of fun. So I get to play with Star Trek every now and then, but there's nothing nothing on the radar yet that I can talk about.
So, real quick, I have to ask now that we touched on that, because I didn't know that's what you were currently doing. There's lots of rumors flying around that there will be a Starfleet in Florida at some point. Is there anything that you can say about that?
I have not heard about anything in Florida.
Okay.
But Ohio, he knows all about Ohio.
But that's not to say that something's not on the horizon, or it's possible we just haven't been contacted yet. It's possible that
No, it's just a lot of.
It's possible it's something CBS is dealing with and not us.
Yeah, Universal just bought up a huge tract of land, and they're supposed to be building a Nintendo themed, and the rumor is Star Trek themed next to it. So, I don't know. That would have been interesting. I imagine that you do a lot of work in China right now if you're doing overseas, right? Because they're building a ton.
That's
of
true.
out there.
It is. We talk a lot with the Chinese.
Yeah, I can imagine. I saw a map, and it's like they're dotting their whole coastline with theme parks.
Yeah, it's the place to be. If you're interested in this line of work, that's the place you got to be.
Well, last question I have for you before you tell the listeners where they can find you online and social media. What's your favorite underrated Superman comic that you've read?
Underrated.
What do you think is like I love the Alternative Factor, and I will scream from the tops of the hills that Alternative Factor is my number 2 favorite Star Trek episode.
I love the Alternative Factor.
Yes.
I think that now
validation at last.
You know what? I think that that's a really high concept show, and people say, "Oh yeah, but it was carried out really poorly," and it was. You know what? That's a heavy show, man, and I think it's great. I love watching that episode.
Right on, you're my new best friend.
I mean, if you think about what Lazarus 2 sacrifices.
Yes.
I mean, for all eternity, he's going to be there with Cuckoo Lazarus number 1, preventing reality from being destroyed. That's pretty intense.
Wow.
I So is there any Superman comics that you love that you just don't think get enough attention? I guess that's any issue that you like to read, that you like to go back to, that you don't think gets enough attention.
One of my favorite all-time Superman stories is something called "What's So Funny About Truth and Justice," and not to take up too much time, but back in the 90s, comics kind of took this turn where people wanted their heroes to be vigilantes in the sense that they exacted justice with a pound of flesh. Everyone kind of went that route. Certainly Wolverine was on every comic and he was very vicious. Batman became, they put Azrael in his place and he was very vicious. And then they created this group called the Authority, that, was this comic about these superheroes who, it wasn't about supervillains really per se. It was more about, well, this guy is the head of a foreign state and we don't like what he's doing, so we're going to murder him. And, every 4-issue kind of arc was the same. Some villain shows up and does something really, really horrific in the world. And then the Authority confront him and get their asses kicked. And then they regroup in issue 3. And then in issue 4, they murder him in the most over-the-top heinous way you could ever imagine, and it was, and people were eating it up. People loved that kind of reaction. And so a guy named Joe Kelly did an issue of Batman. It's Action Comics 775, I think. And he introduces this group called the Elite, which is really a ripoff of the Authority. And it's what happens when Superman, who is, someone who uses his power to help and believes in good and truth and justice, and what happens when he runs into a group that does that. And it's all about that interaction, and it's really good. It's a really good issue. So I would say, if you have not read Action Comics 775, it's called What's So Funny About Truth and Justice. It really is good. In fact, I think they made an animated movie about it called Superman versus the Elite, and they touch on a lot of what happens in the comic. But I would read the comic first. It's really good.
Well, Dave, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. We appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. Where can the listeners find you online? Anywhere on social media? I'm
on Twitter, and my handle looks like It Means Hope, but the I in it is actually a small L, so it's more like Lieutenant Means Hope.
Well, talking with Dave Rossi is not the only thing we've been discussing here on the network this week. So take a listen to this clip and see what else you may have missed elsewhere on Trek FM.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
She is going to be one of the greatest comedic stars of this century. She is going to be amazing, and I love her. She's hilarious. But Tilly has become solely comedic relief in this episode, and Tilly is not just comedic relief. She is smart. Tilly is a smart person. She knows her job. She is going to be one of the greatest captains in Starfleet. I believe that.
Warp 5.
Wait, hold on. You don't have a reflection. There's beams of light traversing the ship, cutting you. And my lack of logic is what's astounding here?
Yeah, because you made an assumption based on zero evidence.
Except for the fact that they just melted.
Yeah, the three that we've seen, we don't know that what the rest of them are doing. This is the first one. We don't know if it was
anymore.
Okay, let's scan the melting.
Earl Grey.
But yes, I was a huge Star Trek fan. Never in my life ever imagined that I would ever appear or meet some of those fabulous people on that show. Never thought, and meet Gene Roddenberry. I never thought I would ever meet. Most of my life, I never thought would happen. So I feel very, very fortunate.
The 602 Club.
And it really speaks to me, Halliday's ego even, of I'm going to make everyone love what I love, and then that's how they'll win the contest. You know, and it's sad that it feels like it all became that, what you're saying, Matt, of everyone not even having the creativity to have their own stuff anymore. It's all about what Halliday was interested in. And then I think, too, it really also could be even a commentary about greed in society now, that everything really revolved around wanting to get his fortune. So they did all the research they had to do because they just wanted the money.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join in the conversation about your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe and up, and away! You'll find us wherever you can get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, Superman said up, and away, didn't he?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'm pretty sure that he did.
Or was that Toy Story?
No, that's a different thing altogether, for heaven's sake. It was up, and away, back in the olden days.
Okay, good. At least I know what I'm talking about. I don't watch Superman. I don't read Superman. I don't know. So I don't really know. That's why I was asking. I wanted to find a comic I can read, right? That's why I asked that question.
You're so smart.
If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review, but don't send us any kryptonite. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 from our website or grab the RSS link as well. And it's also available at the Daily Planet.
That Metropolis, they're an up-and-coming city to watch.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send a show and select Warp 5. That will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. So, Brandon, when you're not making new best friends over the love of a single show, where can listeners find you?
Alternative Factor is awesome. I feel so vindicated, I might watch it tonight. You can find me on Twitter at Brandon-Shea Mutala. You can find me on Facebook every once in a while on the Babel Conference. You can find me here on the network with new episodes of The Edge. And you can find me over on the Fandom Podcast Network with my friends Chris and Tom, where we talk about Alfred Hitchcock in our show Good Evening, an Alfred Hitchcock podcast. And there may be something near and dear to my heart on the horizon, so be sure to watch my feeds for what that could possibly be. And Patrick, where can people find you when you're not trying to super computer generate old episodes of Star Trek and make them look really good?
So, nowhere, because that takes so much time that I just don't have time to do anything else. But if I were to have time, it would be on Twitter at MagicDrop5. That is one word with the number 5 being an actual number. And I pop up in the Babel Conference. Not quite as busy as the rest of you guys yet. That may or may not be changing in the near future, with a couple things popping up. But check out my Twitter and you can find out what's going on. And that's about it. Brandi, where can people find you when you're not fawning over comic books with Dave Rossi?
That's all I want to do now. It's just that forever. You can find me in the Babel Conference lurking, although not as much as usual because my life got really busy recently. And you can, of course, hear me on the strangeanddeadly.com podcast, the Dark Corner podcast with my husband Dave. There are colorful metaphors there. Colorful, I can say words. Colorful metaphors. And so, not for children. I pop up on the 602 Club now and again these days as well because I have so many loves. I can't just talk about one of them anymore, I guess. And you'll see me on Twitter at BrandyWine12. Brandy is with an I, 12 is a number. And that I think about covers everything. If you'd like to help us keep all of these wonderful shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. And if you don't know how to spell Patreon, here's how you spell it. patreon.com/TrekFM to get all of the details. We have perks for you. Perks. Everybody loves perks. Early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and so many other things that you don't even know about yet. And it's all available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. I didn't do it dramatically this time. It requires a huge amount of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month. And we appreciate any support you can give us, and we really hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM.
At this time, we would like to thank the wonderful associate producers, who are all men and women of steel.
Yes.
Who support Trek FM, who support Warp 5. And they are the wonderful Norman C. Lau, Floyd Dorsey, Mike Morrison, Tim Cooper, Justin Ozer, Mark Flessa, and Joe Saltzman. You know what? All of them mean hope.
This is true. You got me right here. Right here in my feels.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's all we got for you, so keep calm and boom on.
Keep calm and boom on.
Excellent. Awesome, Dave. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. It was a blast.
Thank you so much. That was a lot of fun. I love talking about this stuff, as you can tell.
Excellent. Right on. Right on. Yeah, anytime. And yeah, it's great to get a little bit more behind the scenes information of Enterprise. So we love it.
On a
Great.
personal note,
Well,
I wish I could just talk to you for another hour about comic books.
I'm on
a comic
Twitter
book collector.
anytime.
Oh, you're gonna get it now. I'm gonna follow you so hard.
My big venture into comics was the Onslaught arc in Marvel.
Oh
Wow,
yeah,
really cool.
That's where it started. I was in junior high school.
Yeah,
then.
well, I was.
we did a crossover comic of Next Gen meets X-Men.
Oh,
Yes,
yes.
yes.
Really,
He
you
also
worked
did a-
on
he
that?
also
Oh,
did a
I
book
gotta
of
get
that,
it
Yeah.
now.
too.
Yeah,
Gotta get it. Excellent.
That's awesome. I think I have it somewhere.
yeah, it's good.
I have the book that I think it was Michael Jan Friedman. Was that an adaptation of the comics, or was that something different?
Oh, I don't know. It
Because there's a novel.
might have been.
I think it was I have both of them. I do think they were tied together.
Okay, yeah. Planet X is the name of the book that
Yes.
Michael Jan Friedman wrote.
Because it was all about Professor X, but being in Star Trek land, which is interesting because he ended up being the same.
Yeah, right.
person, so, and I don't think he was when that book came out. I think that book predates the X-Men movie.
Yes, it does.
So,
Yeah, it does.
yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Excellent. Right on.
All right. Well, thanks, guys.
Thank you so much. We
Thank you.
appreciate you.
Anytime. Have a great night.
Yes,
Great
thank
talking
you
to
very
you.
much for your time.
Great talking to
You
you.
too.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
And good luck to your
Bye-bye.
son.
Bye.